Alright, I think I should say this before anything. I'm a complete noob with soldering and anything that has to do with little electronics. This video is less of a guide and more of how I completed this project myself. So my car's stereo is a JVC R-330. So the main two components I used for this project was a buck converter and a Bluetooth receiver like the MH-M18. There's a different Bluetooth receiver called the MH-M28, which I heard was a bit better. It like amplified the sound or something like that. But I stuck with the M18 because the other one had a micro USB and an auxiliary port. I'm just going to show you here how am I going to use the buck converter. And basically what this does is changes the voltage of your car battery from 12 volts, I think it is, to 5 volts. But if your radio has a USB port, then there's probably already a 5-volt pin somewhere in there. So you might not need the buck converter. Mine didn't have one, it only had an aux port, so I'm just going to use the buck converter. I use a 9-volt battery from the left side. And basically you have a potentiometer. If you turn to the left, it lowers down the voltage. So once you remove your radio, you want to disassemble it. I just found some screws here. Alright, so once you disassemble it and when you're able to access the actual PCB, usually in some radios there's already labeled like 5 volts or ground or volume positive, volume negative, or something of those labels. And this radio doesn't have any of that. And I tried looking up online, I couldn't find anything except the wiring harness. I can know which wire goes where, and from there I can figure that out. You're going to want to use a multimeter if you don't have anything labeled, and you want to follow the traces you see here. So you're going to want to look at the port in my situation because nothing wasn't labeled, so I wrote everything down on a notebook. So it goes 1 to 8 and then 9 to 20. Pin 1 is ground. Pin 16, which is a constant 12 volts. So even though my car is turned off, the Bluetooth receiver still is on. I thought that would be a problem, but so far, I mean, it's been like a month and it hasn't done anything bad, or I haven't been stranded with a dead battery. But you might want to figure that out if you're worried about that. We're going to flip it on the other side where it shows all the traces. I'm going to trace the first pin and see anything that I can use from the top side. And after tracing the pins, I found from the top side, there's a number called B194. This line of metal is ground, so I can use that as ground. And now when tracing the 12 volts, I found that B314 and B320 are both 12 volts. So I can use one of those. I'm just going to use the B320 since it's the more exposed one. So I couldn't really find the left or right from the 16 port. So I couldn't figure that out, so I just used the actual head unit. So from the head unit, there was 3 metal solder joints where the aux port is located. One had to be ground, the other had to be left, and the other had to be right. That's what I assumed. And I just used the multimeter to trace which one was left, which one was right, from the aux port to the, I think it's a 20 pin connector that connects to the actual stereo. So instead of a constant 12 volts, I try to use this other pin called accessory, I think it's called. And basically, it's when you turn your car on, it would also turn on your lights. And I try to wire that for my Bluetooth receiver. The accessory pin, which was B915, I wired that up to my receiver and it didn't do anything. Like the radio actually didn't turn on at all. So I don't know if I did something wrong or just wiring that to my buck converter just didn't work at all. So I had to stick with the constant 12 volts. Alright, so now for the left and right. I try to keep everything on the top side of the PCB so any wires from the bottom side wouldn't interfere with the casing of the radio. I never figured out which one was left or right for the aux port in the head unit, so I just kind of guessed, and I really was just going to play music or listen to a podcast, so I really never needed the left and right to be correct. So I couldn't find any good pins on the top side of the PCB, so one wire had to go on the port which connects the head unit, and one wire had to go below the PCB. Now I just needed to wire everything with the buck converter and the Bluetooth receiver. Alright, so this poorly drawn diagram is which I made in MS Paint is basically just showing where I wired everything. So I'm just going to make sure I make enough room for the buck converter and the Bluetooth receiver. Since I have a CD drive, there's a big bulky box like covering some of the space. So I just find a gap and just put some double-sided tape to put those together on the wall side.
Okay. Are we connected?
Yeah, because that's why I can't I'll explain it later. Okay, there you go.
Here we go. This is my favorite one right here.
So there is a small problem. When I'm connected to my Bluetooth receiver and I put my radio to the max volume, there is some static sound, like a hard drive sound. Now, to overcome this, I read online that you can use a linear voltage regulator instead of a buck converter, but the linear regulator does require more components, like a heatsink, I believe. The noise doesn't really bother me that much. If I put my phone volume to the max, I can't really hear it, and while driving, it just becomes invisible. But yeah, I'm just putting it out there.